have we lost this? Is this something we can't do anymore? Well, there are some individuals who can do some pretty impressive feats of memory. There are actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, some mental Olympics that happen every 4 years. And according to Wikipedia, the last Memorad Olympics, we had a new world record where someone remembered 300 randomly presented digits, single digits, and they could do it in 300 seconds. Memorized it in 300 seconds. That's pretty impressive. And you might think these are really exceptional individuals, and maybe to remember 300 digits in 300 seconds is very impressive. But the average person can do this if they've got the memory techniques, very similar to the ones the monks used, and they practice a lot. It would be not unlike getting ready for a marathon. You might not necessarily be able to win a marathon, but if you put the time and the effort and resources into it, most people could eventually run a marathon. That's sort of what we are not doing. We are choosing not to develop our memory and develop the skills to remember, maybe not 300 digits in 300 minutes, but even 100 digits in 300 minutes would be pretty darn impressive. So what are we choosing to do instead? Like I said, I was interested in children's note-taking for our memory purposes, what they were doing. And what I found is, we are really good at this. Even little kids are really good at this. So I would give them memory tasks. And I would say, you can write or draw anything you want to help you with this task. So they were inventing their own notes. I wasn't telling them how. This wasn't anything they learned in school. And kids were really good at it. And I might get the occasional question like, hey, what is it that I should write? And I'd say, you know, whatever you want to. And they'd be like, okay. Now, I will say that sometimes they make notes that aren't useful. And that could be another whole talk. But they still are really good, and what seems to be more important in figuring out if kids can do this and how effective they do it is more the task you choose as opposed to the idea of externalizing memory to begin with. So over here I've got some pictures of what kids have drawn when they were asked to notate or to remember shapes and colors. And they have no problems. They've got a couple of different ways where they are using different colors to illustrate the colors. They might even write the words down, and they'll draw the shapes. That's, like I say, kindergarten, grade 1. Now, if the information they have to notate is more abstract, that does take a little bit longer. So one of my favorite tasks that I'm going to be talking a bit about involves a memory game where you have to remember the identity and location of a whole bunch of different cards. And it's at about grade 5 that you start getting notations where they do grids and they indicate where the different cards are located in a particular grid. They do it very quick and easy though. This doesn't require me giving them many hints. Actually, if I do give them a hint, then the few kids who can't are pretty quick to pick it up. But they're pretty good at it. And the other thing is when they do this, it really does improve their memory. Maybe not quite as much as an adult, but note-taking for memory purposes works. So that's what do it. So why does it work? That was the other thing I wanted to know. What are we doing with our memory when we choose to go with note-taking as opposed to practice our memory and exercise our memory and keep this in our internal memory? So the first thing I did, what psychologists are so very fond of doing, is I got them to take notes and I say, oh, by the way, you don't get to use them in the task. So I take their notes away and see what happens, and they do very poorly. It's almost as if, in some cases, they never even saw the memory stimuli ahead of time. So it really hurts performance. And this is actually very remarkable, because when you look at memory research, the kinds of things you should do to help you remember things better internally, the more active you are in processing the information, the more elaborate your thinking on it, the better you should be able to remember it. And when you stop to think about what these kids are doing when they're drawing a grid and they're saying, oh, the snowman card is there, okay, the snowman card would be right here in my grid, that's pretty elaborative thinking. And yet, people are not, they're looking like they don't remember anything when I take away their notes. So I was a little suspicious they're not remembering anything. Because if you think about something like using a grocery list or using your cell phone to keep details about an appointment, those are useless if you don't remember you have them and you need to use it. So you do need to use your memory, you just are using it differently. So I'm wondering here, when they're using their notes, are they really remembering nothing at all about the cards? Are they remembering some information that will help them use their notes better? In the memory card game, the identity of cards is pretty easy to remember. We've got really good memory for pictures. So that would be the easy information to have, and then the location information is the harder stuff. So, for example, you turn over the snowman card and you're trying to remember where it is. It didn't look to me like adults were turning over the snowman card and think snowman card and look to see if it was actually there. They usually said, oh, the snowman card, I've seen that before, and then they checked their notes. So what I did is I decided to tease out these two different types of information and see if there's a difference in memory. So what I did, this is with adults and kids, is I tested them first on their memory for the actual cards. So I had some who got to take notes ahead of time about the stimuli, and some who just studied the cards ahead of time. And what I found was when they were looking at when I tested them on just their memory of the cards, they did really, really well. And they were no difference from the people who studied. So they were remembering identity information. But when it came to remembering the location of the cards, that's when you found a difference between the two groups. The people who made notes weren't able to remember much in the way of cards. They weren't that much different than chance, actually, at identifying location. So it looks like when we are making notes, at least for the types of tasks that I am using, that what we are doing is we are selectively remembering some information. And I was interested in why we choose to do this instead. The one thing you might think is, okay, well, we're being lazy when we rely on notes, but in fact, it requires effort to make notes, to figure out what you need to notate, how you're going to notate it, and then actually do the notating. You think back to the drawings I showed you with the grid and all the cards in it, that's quite elaborate. It takes a lot of work. If we trained up our memory ahead of time, those people who can remember 300 digits in 300 seconds should have no problems remembering the location of all those cards. That should be easy if our memory is well trained. So why do we bother with the notes instead? What might be the benefit of selectively remembering information? And I thought, well, let's actually flip that around and think about what might be the benefit of selectively forgetting some information. If you think about my memory card game, if I got you to play that game a whole bunch of times in a row, you would start doing poor and poorer across the games. That's because your memory for the early games starts interfering with your memory for the later games. We call that proactive interference. So you'll be thinking, oh, that snowman card, I've seen that one before. Oh, wait, was that in the last game? So I wondered, these people who were taking notes, who don't seem to remember the location of the cards, will they have proactive interference? So I thought I would check that out. So what I did, this is with adults. I had a control group where I just got them to play a game 5 times in a row. I wanted to see, do I get proactive interference? And what I found was, here I've got memory of the number of turns it took to win the game. That's like an error measure. The more turns you take, the more mistakes you're making, poor performance. So more is bad. And what you can see here is that the control group gradually, other than this odd little dip, gradually gets worse over time. So I do have proactive interference. My note-taking group, though, the first 4 games, they got to play making notes. And what you can see here on the graph is, not surprisingly, the note-taking group is doing better than my control group, which is what I have found before. The making notes does benefit your performance. The other thing you'll notice is this line is relatively straight, so that it protected them from proactive interference. It didn't hurt their performance over time to play the game repeatedly. But what I'm most interested in is the last game that they played, where I said, okay, this time you're playing the game without notes, and I wanted to know what the impact would be. And here the performance definitely deteriorated because they don't get to play with notes. That's normal. What you'll notice about this one is it's not all that different from that there, which is the control group on their very first game. They were not significantly different from the control group on the first game. They were significantly different from the control group on the 5th game. So even though they weren't making notes in that last game, the note-taking previously actually protected their memory. They didn't have the memory of the previous games interfering in their performance at the present game. So it looks like note-taking allows us to facilitate intentional forgetting, where we actively choose to forget information. And I think that this is really important because in this day and age, we get overwhelmed with tons of information, way more than those monks had to deal with. And so what we're choosing to do is we're choosing to remember some types of information, and that information helps us decide where to go and look for information we might need. So we're not cluttering up our mind with memories. If we go back to Plato's quote here, I'll show you, I didn't show you quite all of it. What Plato objected to the alphabet. He thought it would ruin memory, but what he thought the printed word would actually do is he thought that people would start mindlessly memorizing things, and they wouldn't really understand what they were memorizing. And we could have kids learning to memorize, and that's fine, but learning 300 digits in 300 seconds, I mean, it's impressive, but big deal. How can you use that unless it's meaningful? I mean, what the monks were doing, the way they internalized those manuscripts, assuming they understood what they were internalizing, that is really impressive. And so it had the value of the meaning of the information we have that's much more important than necessarily the ability to store a ton of information in our heads. So I think what's happening is we are changing the way we're remembering. We've been doing this for quite a long time, way before cell phones. And we're using our memory much more adaptively and flexibly to be able to handle all the information we have. So this might seem like I'm saying, oh, this is a good thing, and that we're not ruining our memories, but I have an important little caveat to add to this to say it's not quite so simple as that. I think we need to be consciously aware of what we are choosing to remember, and very importantly, what we're choosing to forget. Angie Burt's going to be giving a talk shortly on some really cool research she's doing on taking photos, which she thinks might involve intentional forgetting as well. And while I might be using my cell phone to remember the details of my meetings and all the emails and phone numbers I've got to keep track of, that's fine. But if I'm using my cell phone to keep details about my child's first birthday party, well, that's something else. And it's not necessarily something I want my phone to be remembering for me.